Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Voyage of the Slave Ship Hare, a journey into captivity from Sierra Leone to South Carolina, by Sean M. Kelley, narrated by Tom Zingarelli. Introduction. They had names, the 72 people Caleb Godfrey purchased on the Upper Guinea coast in late 1754, but we do not know what they were. They were mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, brothers, sisters, and cousins. They surely possessed as wide a range of characteristics as can be found in any collection of 72 people. But we will never know what those were. The very existence of the 72 men, women, and children Godfrey packed onto the sloop Hare is revealed to us solely as a consequence of their enslavement. They enter the historical record as a mere tally of goods to be purchased and sold: 28 men, 25 women, 12 girls, and 7 boys. It is no accident that the Hare captives' names were never recorded. Slaves are people whose right to kinship has been extinguished. Names speak to kinship, belonging in a community, and personhood before the law. Godfrey's elision was an intrinsic part of the process through which fathers, mothers, and children were transformed into commodities, the new property tie to the slave owner, displacing the former ties of family and community. None of this means that the Hare captives or any other slaves actually ceased to be people, or forgot who they were simply because someone did not consider it important to record their names, and none of it means that they failed to establish new family and community bonds. Still, we could say so much more about them if we knew their names. This book reconstructs the voyage of a single Rhode Island sloop that carried captives from Sierra Leone to South Carolina in 1754-55. It seeks to answer a seemingly straightforward question: who were the Hare captives? The hope is that grappling with that problem, even if definitive answers should prove elusive, will yield new insight into the old question of the African experience in the New World, an issue that lies at the center of American history and identity. Most Americans are accustomed to thinking of their country as a historical extension of Europe. Few realize that by 1775, enslaved Africans constituted 30% of all Old World migrants arriving in British North America, or that the number of coerced migrants from Africa surpassed the number of free migrants to New England during the so-called Great Migration of the 17th century by a factor of nearly 14. By the time the legal slave trade ended in 1808, the number of African Muslims arriving in North America almost certainly surpassed the number of Puritan Congregationalists coming to their city upon a hill, and by a wide margin. The Hare captives' experience offers a chance to revisit the long-standing historical question of African identities and cultures in the New World. With the inauguration of the modern debate in the 1990s, most historians, anthropologists, and linguists have championed one of two positions. On one side have stood proponents of what might be termed the creolization thesis, the classic statement of which came from anthropologists Sidney Mintz and Richard Price in 1976, and in a revised edition in 1992. Based largely on fieldwork done in the mid-20th century, Mintz and Price argued that it had not been possible for Africans to reconstitute specific cultures and identities in the Americas. The slave trade had recombined Africans of diverse linguistic and ethnic backgrounds to the extent that they constituted crowds more than coherent groups. New World plantations were therefore populated by an aggregate of randomly selected Africans with little in common. In that regard, Mintz and Price's vision of cultural disruption and discontinuity bore a passing resemblance to the older arguments of E. Franklin Frazier, even though in their vision of African American cultures as creative, dynamic, and sharing African-derived grammatical principles, they saw themselves as working in the tradition established by Melville J. Herskovits. Unable to form speech communities, they argued, Africans abandoned their languages and devised creoles. Lacking priesthoods and temples, they improvised new approaches to the sacred. As Mintz and Price stressed, the history of African American culture was one of dynamism and creativity, and given the conditions of the slave trade and the New World plantations, that dynamism and creativity played out primarily in the Americas. The result was a variety of hybridized regional African American cultures with an emphasis on the American. The creolization paradigm dominated most work on North America in the 1970s and 1980s. By the 1990s, however, some historians began to discern shortcomings, their criticisms revolving around a simple point. Creolization scholarship left little room for a discussion of Africa as a historical entity, or of Africans as historical agents with actual discoverable pasts. A new revisionist school of interpretation emerged to challenge the creolization argument. The revisionists differed from the creolization theorists in significant ways. The early proponents of creolization based many of their conclusions on fieldwork undertaken in the Americas, often working backward in time using anthropological and linguistic models. Revisionists emerged out of the field of African history, employing historical and ethnographic methods that centered on Africa and working inductively. Revisionists relied more heavily on archival work. At the heart of their critique was an insistence that the African past was both discoverable and germane to New World history. One of the revisionists' first targets was the notion that the slave trade was a randomizing process, along with a corresponding argument that New World plantations were cultural and linguistic aggregations of Africans of diverse backgrounds. Drawing on existing studies of the slave trade, revisionists argued that most ships purchased a majority of their captives at only a few locations along the coast. The diversity of slave cargoes, they argued, and consequently of New World plantations, had been overstated. The revisionists' arguments found support with the release of the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, TSTD-1, on CD-ROM in 1999, with the updated TSTD-2 version published online in 2008. TSTD-1 recorded approximately 75%, 80% in TSTD-2, of all the slave trading voyages that crossed the Atlantic. The data confirmed that many regions of the Americas received the bulk of their captives from only one or two African regions, and moreover that relationships between specific regions of Africa and America often persisted over decades, if not longer. There was, to be certain, a great deal of variation in the structure of the slave trade over time and space. In addition, because TSTD-1 essentially connected ports with ports, it could not provide definitive answers to questions about the geographic distribution of captives within the New World colonies. One thing, however, was clear. The slave trade was not quite the random or randomizing process that the creolization literature had imagined it to be. It was a highly structured business that was shaped by elaborate, if not always streamlined, networks. Though the new data seemed to imply that African cultures in the Americas were potentially more coherent than the creolization literature imagined, historians on all sides of the debate still acknowledged the need for further empirical research. New work began to use the data to explore not a generalized African culture in the Americas, but the histories of specific African ethnic and linguistic groups in specific New World settings. These studies eventually developed a more nuanced framework for thinking about Africans in the Americas, one centered less on demonstrating pure cultural transplantations than on using specific African cultures and histories as a starting point for discussions of Africans in specific New World locations. To some extent, the new emphasis on cultural dynamism and transformation in the revisionist literature represented a convergence with creolization scholarship. Africans created new cultures and identities in the Americas, but out of specific African historical and cultural materials and at a much more gradual pace than Mintz and Price implied. At the same time, creolization scholars began to shift their focus from the Americas to Africa as the primary locus of ethnogenesis. Surveying the field in 2011, historians James Sidbury and Jorge Cañizares-Esquerra called the creolization revisionist debate over-theorized and increasingly meaningless. Historians, they suggested, should focus on the local variables, contingency, geography, demography, and other material conditions as they modified the beliefs that people from Europe, Africa, and the Americas brought to their interactions. This fundamentally empirical task should be undertaken with theoretical and conceptual awareness, but it is difficult to imagine a new emphasis on empirical research resulting in any kind of consensus. Historians will likely continue to differ in their emphasis on the African versus New World terms of the equation, the timing and nature of cultural transformation, and the level of disruption created by the slave trade. Despite the outpouring of new work inspired by TSTD-1 and TSTD-2, scholars of North America, with notable exceptions, have been slow to initiate a similar re-examination. It is not difficult to understand why. As significant as their numbers may be in North American history, Africans are far more central to the history of Brazil and the Caribbean. It is hardly an exaggeration to suggest that the histories of some New World regions are not merely inseparable from the history of the African diaspora, they are almost synonymous with it. The Catholic colonies have generated some of the deepest research. Scholars have drawn heavily on ecclesiastical records that detail African lay fraternities, marriages, baptisms, and godparentage. Inquisition records, especially, have proven to be among the richest sources available. Comparable studies for Protestant regions, like British North America, where even the reach of the Anglican Church was limited, are simply not possible. Another explanation for the relative paucity of recent studies on North America has to do with the continent's aberrational history of slavery. For most New World slave societies, the institution of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were nearly coterminous. In many cases, the time elapsed between the effective end of the slave trade and the end of slavery was a few decades, less than 4 for Brazil, a bit less than 3 for the British West Indies, and 2 for Cuba. In Haiti, both were terminated at the same time. For places like these, slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were nearly synonymous. But in the case of South Carolina, the total time elapsed between the close of the slave trade and the end of slavery was almost 6 decades. In Virginia's case, it was about 9. It is therefore understandable that many U.S. historians say little or nothing about the slave trade. After all, on the eve of the Civil War, less than 1% of U.S. slaves had been born in Africa. In contrast, when slavery ended in Brazil and Cuba, there were still large numbers of Africans residing in Rio de Janeiro and Havana. Many survived into the 20th century, attracting attention from ethnographers and historians. For all of these reasons, the experiences of Africans on the North American mainland have frequently proven more elusive than those of Africans in other places. The study of individual slaving voyages represents a potentially fruitful, if difficult, way to approach the question of African cultures in the Americas. Most slave ship documents, logbooks, commercial accounts, and mercantile correspondence do not lend themselves to the pursuit, since they deal mostly with the particulars of the ship and voyage. Given their nature, it is difficult to glean much about the lives of the captives before or after their transatlantic passage. Ships' records typically list only the name of the port where the captives embarked and rarely include sales lists with the names of the individuals who purchased them in the New World. Only 23 slave sale records are known to have survived for the nearly 500 vessels that carried captives from Africa to South Carolina before 1776. Of the 23, the Hare's 1754-55 voyage, the records for which are housed at the New York Historical Society, is the most thoroughly documented slaving voyage to 18th century North America and is among the best documented for any time or place. This is true despite the fact that no logbook or ship's journal for the Hare survives. American captains tended to hold on to logs and journals for future reference, so they are seldom found among the merchants' papers that form the bulk of the documentation for the slave trade. However, many of these other documents, which for the Hare include ship's accounts, crew pay records, and a set of letters written by the captain from the coast of Africa, are actually more revealing than logs. Perhaps most important, the surviving records include a list of 24 individuals along the Upper Guinea coast who sold captives to the Hare, and a sales record with the names of the 26 individuals who purchased the captives in South Carolina. These records not only reveal the workings of the colonial Rhode Island slave trade in great detail, but also allow for the drawing of connections from specific geographic locations along the Upper Guinea coast to specific North American slave holdings. The same rare combination of documents also allows for an exploration of many poorly understood aspects of the slave trade, which can in turn shed light on African lives in the Americas. Important questions concerning the structure of slave sales, the shipmate relationship, and the geographic distribution of captives have seen little analysis, which is surprising because there has been much debate about whether Africans lived in culturally and linguistically heterogeneous communities or in more coherent clusters. The Hare captives experience offers indirect support for the revisionist school of interpretation, suggesting the strength and endurance of specific African, in this case Mande, worldviews and cultural practices in the Americas. Like many recent studies, however, this one finds that specific ideas and lifeways did not remain unchanged. The conditions of enslavement and the environment of the New World demanded some accommodation. The Hare captives, like most migrants, likely confronted their challenges by drawing not upon a generalized African culture or grammar, but upon their own historically and culturally specific experiences. As they acted upon these experiences, they inevitably altered their thoughts and practices to suit the American environment, resulting in recognizable variants of the African cultures they had left behind. In addition to providing a focal point for the discussion of African cultures in the Americas, a well-documented voyage like the Hare's permits a weighing of all the variables of the slave trade and diaspora. Unlike a composite study, which draws from a wide variety of sources, a single voyage allows us to monitor the many historically specific conditions, that is, the overall temporal, geographic, political, and economic contexts that together shaped the outcome of the voyage, and, in the process, the movement of Africans into the Americas. Instead of demonstrating the norms of the slave trade, it allows us to see how things came together in this instance. The result sometimes confirms standing interpretations, but just as often it reveals previously unknown problems that force us to reconsider earlier certainties. The story of the Hare captives, then, opens a window to the Atlantic slave trade and the lives of African captives in colonial South Carolina. Still, no voyage, however well documented, can settle all debate in the field. For one thing, although South Carolina, along with Georgia, was the largest importer of African labor in North America, accounting for about 54% of the total, there was little about the Hare's voyage that was typical. Statistically speaking, the typical slave ship sailed from Brazil, purchased captives in West Central Africa, and carried them back to Brazil. North American-owned vessels like the Hare carried only 2.4% of the Africans who crossed the Atlantic as part of the slave trade. North American slave traders, moreover, took most of their captives to the larger West Indian slave markets, 60% overall and 73% before 1776. Rather than to the lesser ones on the North American mainland. Finally, 3/4 of the Africans in South Carolina, or 96% prior to 1776, arrived aboard British, not North American vessels. A more important blind spot has to do with the cultural legacy of the nearly 100,000 Upper Guineans who came to South Carolina and Georgia prior to 1808. A number of valuable studies on the Gullah Geechee language and culture have appeared over the years, all noting the importance of the Upper Guinean contribution. Most, however, are not primarily concerned with the experiences of the migrant generation itself. With feet firmly planted in some later time period, usually in the 19th or 20th century, the discussion of Africans typically amounts to an effort to reverse engineer Gullah, or to disentangle the various cultural inputs of a later, more unified and coherent Creole language and culture. Lorenzo Dow Turner's path-breaking study of the Gullah language, Charles Joyner's historical ethnography of the All Saints Parish, and Margaret W. Creel's analysis of Gullah religious culture in the antebellum period are prominent examples of works in this mode. For studies like these, the migrant generation figures primarily as the African background, heritage, or origin of latter-day survivals or Africanisms. The particulars of the slave trade, the distribution of Africans throughout the colonies, and even the patterns of 18th-century life generally receive little attention. Studying the Hare captives also sheds precious little light on the debate over the origins of Carolina rice culture, or the black rice thesis. Rice culture had been established in the Low Country for a half-century before the Hare captives arrived, so while many of them helped to perpetuate the rice complex by employing their agricultural and other skills in the New World, they were not involved in the initial transfer. In sum, the present work is concerned with the experiences of newly arrived Africans more than with their impact on future generations. The two questions are closely related, both in the historical sense as African migrants laying the foundation of a later Creole culture, and in a methodological sense as historians study Gullah culture for clues to the early experiences of Africans in the Low Country. It is worth emphasizing, however, that these are two distinct approaches trying to answer two different questions, one concerning the African or Upper Guinean or Central African contribution to a later antebellum African-American culture, the other interested in the experience of the captives themselves, for what it reveals about a specific place and time. That place, the Low Country of the 1750s, was experiencing a major transformation in its relationship to the wider world, stimulated by European demand for New World products and made possible by several historical developments, including the stabilization and maturation of the plantation regime and a pause in the seemingly endless progression of dynastic-turned-colonial conflicts that afflicted the entire Atlantic Rim. The volume of the slave trade was about to ascend to unimagined heights. The next half-century would see more Africans carried across the ocean than any other 50-year period, in spite of 3 extended periods of warfare. The years 1751 to 1800 also saw a shift in the region sending captives across the ocean, especially in the case of Upper Guinea, the area visited by the Hare. During the first half of the 18th century, Upper Guinea was a minor contributor to the diaspora, accounting for about 8% of all captives sold into Atlantic slavery. Over the second half of the century, the number of captives shipped from Upper Guinea tripled, while its share of the overall slave trade doubled to 16%. As such, the Hare captives were taken from a part of Africa that was experiencing unprecedented upheaval, which will be explored in greater detail in the chapters that follow. The destination of many, the Rice Kingdom of South Carolina, was one of the plantation colonies that had matured in the decades prior to 1750. Historians generally recognize 3 major phases in the transatlantic slave trade to South Carolina. The first lasted from about 1700 to 1740. Prior to this, the colony imported most of its captives indirectly from Caribbean colonies like Barbados. With the success of rice planting, Carolinians began direct importations, and most of these, perhaps 70%, came from the Central African region of Congo, Angola. Then, in 1739, slaves of probable Congolese origin staged the largest slave rebellion in colonial American history near the Stono River. The following year, the legislature passed a restrictive Negro Act and raised the import duty on foreign slaves, which, in combination with war from 1739 to 1748, effectively ended importations. When peace returned, Carolinians eagerly sought African labor. This time, however, most of the captives, almost 60% in the years leading up to the Revolution, came from Upper Guinea, a region very distant and very different from Central Africa. The Upper Guinea phase of the Carolina slave trade lasted for over 25 years and ended only when the Continental Congress passed an import ban in 1774. Importations picked up again during the mid-1780s and 1790s, with a majority again coming from Upper Guinea. But the third major phase of the slave trade came when the state of South Carolina re-legalized importations in 1804. Driven by the demand in cotton-growing areas, the numbers of imported slaves spiked to unprecedented levels. Even then, Upper Guinea supplied a plurality of the migrants. The influx of Africans then fell drastically once the slave trade was banned by federal law as of January 1, 1808, effectively closing a chapter of North American history. It is hardly surprising that students of Gullah culture have discerned a very strong Upper Guinean influence. Because the Hare helped to connect 3 continents and Barbados, the voyage yields additional insight into still other historical debates, such as New England's involvement in the slave trade. Over the past few decades, historians have methodically dismantled the old notion of New England as a marginal, even reluctant participant in slavery. Bondage in the New England colonies shared many features with systems elsewhere, including violence, exploitation, and a growing emphasis on color. More important, the New England economy depended heavily on trade with slave systems in other parts of the globe, especially the Caribbean. In light of these developments in the literature, we might expect historians to revisit the issue of the New England-based transatlantic slave or triangular trade, which a generation of 19th-century abolitionists and antiquarians saw as the driver of the New England economy. That re-examination has not taken place, however, as historians continue to view New England as a fringe participant in the transatlantic slave trade, operating at a level well below that of major powers such as England. The slave trade, they point out, accounted for only 16 voyages per year between 1730 and 1775, less than 1% of all clearances from New England ports. Though these views rest on empirically sound foundations, they do need to be placed in proper perspective. New England may well have trailed the mother country as a transporter of captive Africans, but Old England had a much larger population. In fact, on a per capita basis, the slave trade was more important to New England, which dispatched one slaver per 1,000 inhabitants annually over the period 1730 to 75, than it was to England, which sent out one ship for every 1,400 residents. Even so, counting voyages is not the best way to gauge the regional impact of what one historian has appropriately called the slave-carrying trade. It is far more useful to calculate the value of slave trading to the economy. As Chapter 1 will show, slave trading contributed at least as much to the New England economy as lumber and whale product exports, and possibly even as much as livestock and meat exports. The only export that contributed more was fish, which in turn was exceeded by the non-human carrying trade. Looking at it that way, slave trading was more important to the New England economy than previously thought, not only in Rhode Island, where it was quite significant, but to the New England economy as a whole. The Voyage of the Hare also sheds light on the face-to-face workings of Atlantic trade. It is easy to get the impression from the literature that the commercial connections undergirding the Atlantic world ran smoothly and efficiently. This tendency is most visible in the familiar textbook graphs, charts, and maps depicting ever-increasing numbers of Africans transported across the Atlantic over the 18th century, but it also comes across in descriptions of the far-flung, complex mercantile networks that orchestrated the trade. Few historians make this argument explicitly, but to the extent that we stress the connective qualities of the Atlantic, we risk overlooking important complicating factors. Researchers in the field frequently encounter frayed connections in otherwise smooth-running transoceanic networks. All of this highlights a central tension in the Atlantic world. Commercial networks that were efficient for their time were simultaneously riddled with seemingly inefficient disjunctures. The transatlantic slave trade is a case in point. Merchants found it difficult to get good information on markets, both in Africa and in the Americas. Mistrust between buyers and sellers on the African coast made the extension of credit from Europe to America to the African interior a challenge. Ultimately, these problems would find a solution, though one rooted in violence. The slave trade was also complicated significantly by the fact that the commodities in play were humans, and unwilling humans at that. By examining the connections between the three regions central to this study, New England, Sierra Leone, and South Carolina, our account of the Voyage of the Hare provides a basis for commentary on these and other incongruities of the Atlantic world. Tracing the Hare as it knit together three disparate locations along the Atlantic rim requires some familiarity with regional languages, place names, and ethnonyms. Some of these entail a certain level of controversy or dispute, which in most cases is addressed within the book. One particularly confusing term is Upper Guinea, which has already appeared here and is worth addressing in detail. Historians of the slave trade have customarily divided the slave-trading portions of the African coast into 7 or 8 different embarkation regions. These regional designations originated among slave traders and later received a certain official sanction in historical circles, figuring prominently in works like Philip Curtin's seminal The Atlantic Slave Trade, A Census, 1969, and TSTD2. While useful, several things must be kept in mind when invoking the designations. The most important is a recognition that these are largely commercial and nautical terms: Windward Coast, Gold Coast, Slave Coast, Bight of Benin, and Bight of Biafra, which make the most sense on shipping charts. The boundaries of these regions bore no relation to the manner in which Africans organized themselves politically, economically, culturally, or linguistically. Sierra Leone was a name given by the Portuguese to a mountainous peninsula that was easily visible from the sea, but the indigenous people did not identify themselves as Sierra Leonean. In fact, a single embarkation region might contain multiple polities, languages, and identities. Indeed, trade routes channeling captives to the coast frequently extended hundreds of miles inland. Coastal designations, therefore, often imply a greater degree of unity and integration than was really the case. At the same time, the opposite is true. The act of drawing a coastal boundary can imply an unwarranted measure of difference and understate the level of integration. This tendency has informed numerous older discussions of the African cultures in the Americas, including the creolization thesis, with many works portraying Africa as a babel of language, culture, and religion. This led many historians to view Africans in the New World in similar terms, fragmented and unable to communicate with each other. This view was compounded by the fact that Africans in the New World had been removed from all things familiar. More recent studies have discerned a greater integration both within and among the embarkation regions. This change in perspective has been most significant for the region where the Hare captives embarked. Though it still appears in TSTD2 and most of the literature as Sierra Leone.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?